Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Greeneville, Tennessee, the home of Andrew Johnson, our 17th president. In last week's video, I visited President Johnson's early home, his tailor shop, and the Andrew Johnson homestead. This week, I'm going to wrap up my visit to Greeneville by visiting the Andrew Johnson National Cemetery, where President Johnson, his wife Eliza, along with other members of his family, are buried. The Andrew Johnson National Cemetery is located just south of downtown Greeneville. The cemetery began as the Johnson Family Cemetery and remained in the family until 1909, when it fell under the control of the War Department. A short time later, the first veterans burial took place, and over the next 20 years, more than 100 veterans were resting on the hillside of what would become known as the Andrew Johnson National Cemetery. In 1942, the National Park Service took control of the cemetery and closed the site to future burials. The Daughters of the American Revolution and the American Legion lobbied for the cemetery to be reactivated. Their efforts were rewarded, and in 1946, the cemetery reopened to burials and remained open until 2019, when once again it transitioned to an inactive status. Today, veterans from the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, both World Wars, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf Wars, are resting here. It should be noted that this cemetery, along with the Andersonville National Cemetery, are the only two national cemeteries that are administered by the National Park Service. It's not hard to find the final resting place of President Johnson and his family. Just enter through the main gate and make your way to the highest point in the cemetery. Here at the top of the hill, you'll find an impressive monument that marks the grave of President Johnson, his wife, and several members of his immediate family. Andrew's political career started here in Greeneville when he was elected as a town alderman, serving with Mordecai Lincoln, who just happened to be a cousin of President Abraham Lincoln's father, Tom. Andrew was very popular with his fellow aldermen and the citizens of Greeneville, and in 1934 he became Greeneville's mayor, and from there he went on to serve in the Tennessee House of Representatives. Andrew became very involved in the Democratic Party, where he was known as a very gifted public speaker. From 1843 until 1953, Andrew Johnson served in the United States House of Representatives, where he continued to expand his popularity throughout the state. He was not only very popular with the citizens of Tennessee, he was also popular with his fellow Democrats, who encouraged him to run for governor. In 1853, Andrew Johnson was elected the 15th governor of the state of Tennessee, serving from October 17, 1853 until November 3, 1857. He decided not to run for re-election as governor, choosing instead to run for the United States Senate. He was elected and took his seat in the upper body in December 1857. By 1859, Civil War was on the horizon. Johnson was a strong supporter of preserving the Union, and when Tennessee voted to secede from the Union, Johnson became the only member of the Senate from a seceded state not to resign. He chose instead to remain in the Senate and become the body's most vocal and prominent Southern Unionist. In March 1862, President Abraham Lincoln appointed then Senator Johnson as the military governor of Tennessee, a position that he held until March 4, 1865, when he became the Vice President of the United States, serving under Abraham Lincoln. In the weeks following the inauguration, Johnson found the office of Vice President to be incredibly boring. His only official duty was to preside over the Senate, which he did so on a couple of occasions. Johnson was considering returning to Tennessee to visit his wife when word reached Washington that General Ulysses S. Grant had captured the Confederate capital of Richmond and was pursuing General Robert E. Lee's army of Northern Virginia west. With the war's end in sight, Johnson decided to remain in Washington. On the afternoon of April 14, 1865, Lincoln and Johnson met for the first time since inauguration. The two men discussed a long and difficult period of Reconstruction, a matter that the two disagreed on. Johnson urged President Lincoln not to be too lenient on the traitors of the South, while Lincoln, on the other hand, wanted to concentrate on rebuilding and reunifying the nation, rather than punishing the South. Later that night, Vice President Johnson was asleep in his room at the Kirkwood House when he was awakened by a fellow boarder and told that President Lincoln had been shot while attending a play at Ford's Theater. The Vice President rushed to the Peterson House across the street from the theater where the President had been taken. Upon his arrival, he was informed that the wound was indeed mortal, and it was only a matter of time before President Lincoln would enter into eternal rest. President Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. A few hours later, Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase administered the oath of office to Andrew Johnson, making him the 17th President of the United States. Almost immediately, Johnson conducted his first cabinet meeting in the Secretary of Treasury's office. During the brief meeting, he asked that all cabinet members remain in their position. They all agreed. It was obvious from the start that Reconstruction would be very difficult. The nation and Congress was still divided. President Johnson often found himself on an island, being at odds with Congress and members of his own cabinet. His popularity dropped, and it became difficult for him to accomplish even the simplest legislative task. Johnson and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton found themselves at odds at whether the military who was in command of the southern states could override civilian authorities. President Johnson took the position that the military could not. Stanton and members of Congress that was loyal to him passed the Reconstruction Act, which was directly in opposition to President Johnson's position. The president quickly vetoed the measure. Congress overrode the veto, which signaled the beginning of the end to Johnson's presidency. President Johnson promptly dismissed Stanton and appointed Lorenzo Thomas to replace him. Stanton refused to leave office, and on February 24, 1868, the United States House of Representatives voted 128 to 47 to adopt 11 articles of impeachment against President Johnson for violation of the Tenure in Office Act. On March 5, 1868, the impeachment trial began in the Senate, with Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase presiding. After a 3-month trial, it was time for the senators, who were serving as jurors, to vote. 2/3 of the voting senators were needed to convict and remove President Johnson from office. When the roll call vote was complete, 35 senators voted guilty, 19 voted not guilty. The Senate had failed by a single vote to convict and remove President Johnson from office. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton relinquished his office on May 26, 1868. And a few days later, General Ulysses S. Grant became the Republican nominee for president. President Andrew Johnson was the first president to be impeached by the House and tried by the Senate. He was acquitted in the Senate by just a single vote. For more than 100 years, Andrew Johnson held the distinction of being the only president to be impeached. President Bill Clinton and Donald Trump became the second and third presidents to be impeached. Neither were convicted in the Senate. On March 4, 1869, President Andrew Johnson left office, ceding power to President Ulysses S. Grant. President Johnson returned to his home here in Greeneville, Tennessee, but after becoming accustomed to the more fast-paced life in Washington, Johnson found life here in Greeneville to be somewhat boring. After a few years of living a quiet and boring life here in Greeneville, Andrew decided he wanted to clear his name and extract a measure of revenge from his detractors. The way to do that was to re-enter politics. Andrew Johnson announced that he was seeking election to the United States Senate. and despite everything that had happened, he was indeed elected to the upper body. And when he was sworn in as a United States Senator on March 4th, 1875, he became the only former president to serve in the Senate after leaving office. In July 1875, following a special session of the Senate, former President and now Senator Andrew Johnson was returning home to Greeneville. On his way, he decided to stop at his daughter Mary's home near present-day Elizabethton, Tennessee. On the night of July 28, 1875, President Johnson suffered a stroke. Doctors arrived the next day and began treatment. But on the evening of July 30th, President Johnson suffered a second, more severe stroke. Early the next morning, on July 31st, 1875, 66-year-old Andrew Johnson passed away. His funeral service was held in Greeneville on August 3rd, 1875. Following the service, Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States, was laid to rest here in the Andrew Johnson National Cemetery. And according to his wishes, his body was wrapped in an American flag, and a copy of the United States Constitution was placed under his head. Well, this concludes my visit to Greeneville, Tennessee. I hope you enjoyed this two-part video centered around the Andrew Johnson National Historic Site and the Andrew Johnson National Cemetery. If you did, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up, and if you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to my channel. It really helps, and it's free. Now, until next time, please remember, life is a wonderful journey. Be sure to take time and enjoy it, and I'll see you down the road. So long, everybody.